Okay, so in this tutorial, I'm just going to teach you how to do a tripod track in Blender. And this is something that there actually aren't too many tutorials about, but I'm going to walk you through some of the most important steps. So we do our tracking. This is Blender 2.8, so it's slightly different than previous versions. We do it in the movie clip editor. And so I have this footage of greening on my iPod. If I just brought that footage in, first off, we don't want to use our raw footage when we're doing special effects in Blender. It usually works in After Effects, but a lot of programs don't like movie files. They like image sequences. But also we bring it in and Blender sees it as upside down. Sometimes it's right side up. It's just how the iPhone shoots. But so that's okay. We're going to convert this to an image sequence anyway. So I'm going to delete that clip. And to convert something to image sequences in Blender, it's really easy. It takes a little bit of time to export it, but it's really easy. So go to the video sequencer and you're going to bring in your movie clip. And by default, we don't see what we're looking at. So up here in the top left, click the sequencer and we want to see sequencer/preview. So we can see it's upside down. Now I'm going to open the properties within and I'm going to select my movie clip, which is the dark blue. I'm going to scroll down to where it says video and I can flip it on the X and the Y, which reorients my video. And then I would typically maybe grab the whole shot or find the shot that you want. And down here in your timeline, you can set in frame. Now in Blender 2.8 by default, here's where our render settings are. Here's where our export settings are. By default, it's set to 1920 by 1080, which is the exact resolution of this image, so I don't need to change anything. If you're in Blender 2.79, it's usually set to 50%, so you'll get JPEGs that are half the resolution that you need. So make sure that that's right. Also, we don't want PNGs. Those are going to be way too, it's going to be a memory problem. So let's set it to JPEG because it's the final image sequence will look the same if it's using individual JPEGs. And set your output folder. So normally what I do is let's see. So I create a folder in Blender. I find wherever I want it in my computer, create a folder, and I'll call it image sequence 3. You could name it whatever, hit accept. And then the frame rate should be updated based on when you drag it in. So that's the frame rate. It doesn't matter, it's going to image sequence. So then you can go render animation, and it's going to spit out frame by frame, and it takes less than a second to do each frame, but for 500 frames it takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so I already rendered out this image sequence, but I can't stress enough, if you try to do this tracking with movie clips, it's going to work. And that's what the part that tricks you. It works, and then all of a sudden one day you'll find as you're exporting an animation, there's frames that kind of skip and stuff, and it took me a while to figure out, oh, it's just because I was using a movie clip. So just get into the habit right away of image sequences, and you'll save yourself some heartache and stress. Plus, I think it's just good practice when you're doing, more intense visual effects. Okay, so open up. We're going to hit open, and I already saved this into something called image sequence 1, and I'm going to hit A to select everything, and then hit open clip. And if you were to just bring a clip into the default Blender with 250 frames, you can do this set scene frames, and it will adjust the length of your timeline to match the length of the movie clip. But I'm going to trim a little bit off. Set start frame, set end frame. And this is actually quite a dramatic tripod track. It's about a 45-degree turn. Normally I only use tripod tracks for handheld footage, and you might only see a 5-degree pan left or right, or maybe a 10-degree tilt from top down. So this is pretty dramatic. So I think I will need it to be a longer clip. Okay. The other button I like to push is this prefetch. So as you can see, it's turning the faded blue into a more saturated blue, and that's what it's doing, is it's caching the frames into my memory. And you can see the memory use of Blender going up down here in the bottom right. We're up to 3 gigabytes. If for some reason Blender maxes out and it won't cache everything, you can change that in the preferences. So go to Edit, Preferences, and then in General, at the bottom of the General setting, under Memory Limits, scroll down and you'll see that my sequencer cache limit, which also works for the movie clip editor, is set to 6,000 megabytes or 6 gigabytes. So I'm only using half of my limit, but I could up that if I wanted, depending on how much RAM your computer has. If you only have 8 gigabytes of RAM on your computer, you might want to set that to 5 gigabytes so it leaves room for other things to operate on your computer. Okay. So I'm gonna talk about some shortcuts. So to skip back to my beginning frame, I'm gonna hit Shift left arrow and then I jump back. And there used to be a button to add a track, and I don't see that button anymore. It could be hiding in one of these menus, and we'll look in those menus in a little bit. But if you hit Control and click somewhere in an area with high contrast, so like the star, you know, there's high contrast between the wall and the star. So there's my track marker, and if I hit I can track forward with this plus button or this play button, or if I hover over it, I see that the shortcut was Control T. Now, when your track gets to the edge of the frame, and when it goes off the frame, you can see where it is right there. It's like perfectly centered, and then right at the edge, you're gonna see it slips just a little. And little slips like that might not make a difference, but sometimes they do. So what I like to do is back up a frame when it's correct, and then I just delete that final point. You can do it in the track and clear everything after, and it deletes all the tracking after. So basically we have a solid track right there. Okay, so we have one. I'm just going to go through and pick some more points, and you want, since we're doing a tripod track, you want your points kind of spread across the frame. So maybe I could have had a point more toward the left, but I'm going to do another point here. Maybe right here. So I'll go to the first frame because I can see it the whole frame. It's cool when you can have tracking points that last the whole video. I think those are the most successful and useful points, but I'll hit Control T now instead of the play. And did it last? So it didn't quite make it. And that one seems to hold. You could set up all your tracking points and have them all selected and then hit Control T and track them, but I like to go through and just make sure they're looking good. So I tried this before, and I tried tracking a tree, and I think it's possible there might be a slight movement on the branches, so I'm not going to track that. I'm also not going to track this pole because I think since I wasn't actually using a tripod, I think this pole shifts a little in relation to that background. So since I want a solid tripod track, I'm going to pick points in the distance. So like this chimney, and then I'll hit Control T. If I want another cool little trick is if I click this little lock button up here, it's going to center my tracking point, and then if I hit Control T, the tracking point stays in view, but the frame moves. So that's kind of a neat little feature. So that one stayed in the frame the whole time. Let's find a tracking point, maybe right here, and I'm going to hit Control T, and it stays in the frame. And now I'm going to just kind of look for when this one disappears right at the end. So you want to make sure as tracking points disappear, your results get worse. So like this one's about to disappear on the far left. So maybe I'll add in a tracking point significantly before that one disappears, maybe like right here. There's a high point of contrast. Also, this has a lot of blue in it. So if I maybe turn off the red channel and the green channel, or maybe keep the green on, I can increase, you can increase the look of contrast and make it easier for Blender to track. That's just a little trick. Yeah, and as you can see that you can see the lens distortion, and you can see that pole moving because the iPhone has such a wide angle lens, there's actually some lens distortion going on. But you only see that when you lock the track to the center. And maybe I'll go to the ending of it and put another tracking point on this window maybe right here, and I'll turn off the shortcut to track backwards. You can track, you can hit that backwards play button. You can also go frame by frame, which is Alt and the arrow you want to go, or you can hit Control-Shift-T to track backwards. And it's probably gonna notice how it slips pretty bad right there. So I'm gonna go after, so it's slipping really bad. And basically, so everything before, this is what's coming after the blue, the red is what's before. So I think I'm gonna say clear before, which is clear before is Shift-T. So now we have some solid tracks. Okay, so I think this will work. The thing you want to kind of pay attention to is I don't have like an excessive amount of tracks. I'm not tracking like 10 points in this region, 10 in that. Sometimes that can help, but usually the more tracking points you have, the more room for error you have. The more chances of error you have. So now we have our tracking points, and let's just see what happens if we click to this Solve tab, and we have to tell Blender that we're doing a tripod track, and then hit Solve Camera Motion. So our error is 6, which sometimes is okay for a tripod track. If this was a 3D camera track, you would want 1 or below. But one way to improve your track significantly, we'll see how good it goes, is by updating your camera info, specifically what sensor size was and what the focal length is. So luckily I was using an iPhone, and by clicking these dots and lines I can do a preset, and it knows that the iPhone, maybe it's a different sensor, but roughly it was a 4.5 millimeter sensor, and the focal length was 4. You can look up sensor size of your camera online and input it in there, and then you just have to know what focal length you were shooting at, so pay attention to that. So I'm going to hit Solve Camera Motion again, and now we have an error of 0.7, which is pretty much as good as it gets, but we can make it a little better. Remember, there is some distortion if I lock to this track. As you see, as the camera moves, there's less distortion in the center of your frame than on the edges, basically. And that is, these K1 and K2 values are like how much distortion there is. And I don't mess with them much, but I can refine, firstly, I can refine the focal length, and Blender will try to update that to be even better. So now we have a 0.3 error just by improving that focal length by 2. It said 4.1 or something, now it says 4.2. But now let's see if we can improve the distortion by refining focal length and K1 and K2. And now we have a 0.32. So it didn't help much, but this is like a really solid track. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to place your camera. Oh, a couple things to keep in mind, especially with 3D camera tracking, if you're getting like wildly different results, sometimes just changing 1 or 2 tracks, or if you were doing a 3D camera track, changing these keyframes of where it's searching. But to see what your individual points are, if you go up to, let's close these, to the marker settings, so it's kind of changed. Well, maybe they'll change it back, but if you click on these markers, you used to be able to view what the errors were, and you can see the average error of this tracking point is 0.2. If I click this one, it's 0.4, so this one is maybe a worse track. So maybe if you had a bad marker, you could delete it or adjust it. They'll probably bring those settings back, but that's just something to keep in mind. So we'll go to our 3D viewport, and I deleted the cube because I like kind of a clean space to work. So the first thing I like to do is go to, well, the first thing, I'll click this camera, and I'm going to go, now I can have this camera settings. I'll jump into the camera with 0. And it looks like it updated, you know, my camera to the right focal length because I put that in when I put it in the movie clip editor. And I'm going to turn on background images. So they changed where background images is located in Blender. So I'll turn background images on in the camera. I'll add an image. I'll switch it to movie clip, and there it is. And we have our panning clip. Next, so now the camera isn't moving, but we need it to move. So we're going to add a constraint. So right above that camera is constraint, and we'll say camera solver. And now our camera has the right movement, but it's in its default location. So if we look at like the ground plane, yeah, it looks weird. So we need to, here is kind of the hard part to get used to, but it's such a valuable thing. It's how to line your like virtual camera up with a plane, in this case the ground, of your video or picture. So if you just wanted to use a picture and make it look like something was sitting on a table, you know, how do you get this ground plane to look like it's on the table of your picture? And here is the easiest way, although it does take some practice. So I'm going to split the view. When you get better at it, you won't have to split the view. So this will be our camera view, and we'll be like looking at our plane and seeing how close we get. But normally what I do is I just clear out all the information on this camera as far as rotation and position goes. So I'm going to hit Alt-G to clear the position and Alt-R to clear the rotation. So now it's looking straight below this plane. I'm going to bump it up 5 Blender units on the Z-axis so I can see the ground plane again. So G to move it, and Z to constrain to the Z-axis, and 5. So now I see my ground plane again. And then I'm going to want to rotate the camera around, you know, this position to see if, but anyways, if I try to rotate it on the X, that actually doesn't work too bad. But what you should do is you want to constrain the pivot point to this 3D cursor, which you can do up here, where it says 3D cursor, or if you hit period, you can choose from here. These pie menus are kind of interesting. If I hold period and then move to the right and then let go, I just changed the pivot point. Okay, so just take some practice. So RX, so I'm going to bring this down, and our goal for the first step is we want to match up. So where this ground ends out there, we want to match that up with our horizon line. And Blender changed kind of how they did things, so it's harder to see, but I might look over on the side as I rotate and constrain to the X, and just kind of get a rough, you know, you can kind of see. It also might help to go to your background images and turn down the alpha. So let's go to frame 1 again, shift left arrow. And my horizon is somewhere right where my mouse is, because I remember seeing those mountains. So I'm going to hit R and X and bring it right to about there. And this is literally just eyeballing it, rough estimate, but it should be pretty good. So now we kind of push through our plane. So first line up the horizon, then, you know, kind of guess what height you're at. You know, rough estimate is fine. So I was not on, this is the ground, so I was, you know, way above the ground. And then I like seeing my origin within my camera view. So I'm going to move it on the Y-axis, so GY. Just keep moving. And actually, maybe that's too much. I'm just going to move it down a touch. So now let's see what we're looking at. The good news is our ground, you know, it looks more like it fits with the video. Just to tweak things a bit, I like my axes to kind of match my world, the X and Y. So I'm going to hit RZ and rotate around the pivot point. So now this kind of looks more logical to me, like the what do they call those? leading lines or horizon. Yeah, you know, you see greening has lines going that way and right here this way. I kind of like to match those up. But to me, it kind of looks like maybe my horizon is a little low. So if I try to rotate on the X now, it's going to give me weird tilts. So if I, here's why. My camera's off-centered, right? So RX, it's like, you know, moving the camera strangely. But if I hit RXX, it's going to constrain. So I'm just bringing up that horizon a little bit more. So anyways, hit RXX and constrain it to the rotation of the camera. So it's moving actually up and down. So this is pretty, you know, this would be a success. You could use this for a project. So the next part that I think you can figure out is, you know, you have a cube, you go to the beginning, you know, set a keyframe and go to the end, just move it on the x-axis, set a keyframe, and now you have an object that's animated within your scene, but it's also, you know, it's also like relating to how the camera moves. So that's pretty cool.